and welcome back to our tutorial, Harnessing the Tools of Democracy. I'm Max Strasser. I'm a senior editor with the opinion section of the New York Times, based in London. And now we're going to be moving into a slightly new territory. After hearing from Prime Minister Mitsotakis, we're going to be moving from sort of the high level of politics, the prime ministerial level, to a more popular level. We're going to be talking about people and not politicians as much, about how people can make their voices heard in democracy and in governance. I think this is a really important topic. I think that a lot of the most interesting research and political theory right now is around these subjects. I also think it's a crucial subject after the last few years. I think if you look at the populist backlash, a lot of that has been driven by a feeling that people are not being listened to, a feeling that governance and government has not been responsive. And so as we think about our topics here, resilience and renewal of democracy, thinking about how to renew our democracies by making them more responsive and more transparent, I think is really important. So to that end, we're going to have 4 truly expert speakers on these topics. They're each going to be giving a short presentation. Afterwards, we'll have a question and answer session. I think you're all going to have a lot to think about as they speak, so please take notes, write down your questions so that you can bring them up at the end. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. They'll be speaking in this order. First, we have Alberto Alemanno. He's a law professor who runs a startup about increasing accountability. Aura Cifuentes is working with the Colombian Ministry of Information and Communications Technology on transparency issues. Claudia is with the O.E.C.D. She's doing research and advocacy on deliberative democracy. And Davide Casaleggio is working very directly on these issues in Italian politics, as you'll hear. You all have their bios in front of you, so you can read their many accolades and credentials, but that's the most important information for now. So without further ado, I will introduce Alberto. He'll be telling us a little bit more about democracy.
Thank you, Max, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Athens Democracy Forum for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts that are going to start our conversation today. My first claim today is that, contrary to conventional wisdom, is not necessarily democracy to be in crisis. Democracy is alive and kicking. There's greater interest in what is actually happening, not only in our own country, but also in other countries, given the interdependence as highlighted by the COVID pandemic. What we're witnessing is rather a crisis of representation. That is, the mechanism we use to aggregate preference and translating them into actual policy action. That's where we struggle. That's where the legitimacy coming from the electoral process is not sufficient, and where politicians themselves look for alternative forms or cumulative forms of legitimation. Let me step back based on my research, but also based on the engagement with a variety of civil society organizations and also progressive companies over the last few years. I realized that the big question we should ask ourselves much more often is, how can we prompt change in our society? That's what my students ask me every time they see me. That's what I hear from NGOs, civil society organizations, and even companies today. How can we lead change? This is a question that has been somehow epitomized by major movements spreading across the world, somehow symbolized by Greta Thunberg activism in raising awareness in a much more effective way than a variety of dedicated civil society organizations, environmental organizations in an incredible way. And the answer to that question is pretty conventional, right? There's this kind of well-rehearsed script that says, well, you can certainly vote. This is something we do every few years. And if you're really brave enough, you can also run for office. So this is the alternative, right? We don't really have many other options which are presented to us in our civic education when we are at school or when we are in society. But it's pretty clear that today voting is a bit too little. Again, there's just too much time from one election to another. And today we have the epistemic ability to actually contribute much more, so it's just too little. And perhaps running for office is a bit too much. It's not something that everybody can afford in terms of trade-off between personal and professional life. So the challenge is really, how can we capture what we feel in society? Electoral democracy, when you look at turnout at the global level, is going down. But when it comes to participatory democracy, the desire to contribute and share our skill sets and ideas is certainly growing. But we are missing such an opportunity because our system is not able to actually absorb those dynamics. So my second claim is that we need to conquer that space, a space that has been left empty for just too long. According to representative democracy, we elect our representatives, they're there for a few years, and we do nothing. Right? The assumption was that these people were paid to think and act on our behalf. They were more experts, they had the knowledge, they had the time. It's no longer the case. That's pretty clear, and therefore we need to occupy that space with some new forms of engagement. This is what we call democratic innovation, which, according to many, might be an oxymoron, right? How democracy can be innovative if it doesn't really change so much in terms of electoral choice of our representatives. So one deliberate wave, as Claudia has been calling, and all the work of the O.E.C.D has been pinpointing, is one democratic innovation, moving away from classical electoral democracy and relying on sortition, exactly like in the Nix did a couple of millennia ago. Starting from this idea that anyone can actually contribute and provide advice to elected representatives, perhaps also setting the agenda, making sure certain issues become important, and to trigger the kind of responsiveness that Max was saying is kind of lacking today. Another example of democratic innovation I'm very dear to, because it's something I've been promoting and advocating for, is to enable citizens to occupy this space in between elections by actually organizing the same way as corporations and organized interests do, because historically they've been pretty active in that space in between elections. So how we can open up in order to make sure that at the end of the day, all these democratic innovations will be complementary as opposed to antagonistic to representations. In other words, today representatives need citizens as much as citizens do need representatives. But how can we create new feedback loops between them beyond elections? And I think this is the challenging theoretical but also practical aspects in our new thinking around democracy. I have a few illustrations which are a bit personal, but which show how setting the agenda today it is possible in the space between elections. In 2012, together with my students, we asked the European Union to actually stop international roaming charges, which prevented citizens from actually receiving and making calls across the Union unless they were willing to pay very high amounts. We set the agenda, political parties had to take a stance, and this issue got into the policy process in a way in which electoral democracy would have never imagined. They were not there. This issue was simply not in the agenda. Another example might be plain packaging for cigarettes. It started off in Australia, it went to Canada, and now is all across Europe, a way to basically reduce attractiveness of tobacco vis-a-vis the youth. Another example is whistleblowing protection. You might remember in 2014, the world was split. Those who really think that Ed Snowden was actually somebody who should be put in jail, and the other people were celebrating them. On the very same day in which the European Parliament gave this gentleman, the first European whistleblower, Antoine Deltour, the award for European Citizen of the Year, the Luxembourgish court called him and started prosecuting him. It was pretty schizophrenic. This issue was a hot potato. No political party in Europe wanted to take a stance on. We started through a coalition, which was pretty unconventional, and we put the issue on the agenda. And after 2 years, the European Commission decided to come out with the most ambitious piece of regulation protecting whistleblowers and asking both private and public employers to protect those people who actually blow the whistle in order to tackle corruption. Another example has to do with integrity. For 2 years, revolving doors were culturally accepted all across European countries. Well, now when a former politician leaves office, well, there should be a cool-off period which allowed that particular individual, let's say, to have a soft landing, which is not monetizing on his own, let's say, contacts and powers, but is something that is kind of checked by third party, by ethics bodies, and this is something that is happening all across. To sum up, I think what we need more to focus on in order to enrich representation is to have functions that somehow set the agenda by sharing ideas that come from the bottom up, but also provide advice. This is the role of mini publics and deliberative democracy, but also hold representatives into account when they are not necessarily sticking to the social and political contract we have in our society. So I think that's how we are today, how we stand, where we stand today, with a very difficult under-theorized question, which is the major conundrum for all of us in democratic innovation, which is, yes, we can embrace new experimentation, we can have new models of, let's say, shaping our democratic environment by holding accountable representatives, sharing ideas with them, but what do we do with this participatory output? If you think about the French experiment of the climate convention or the Grand Débat, the major difficulty was to transform those ideas into actual policy outcomes. And that's where the situation gets stuck, because the legitimacy that the representatives claims, we have been elected, is clearly conflicting with the legitimacy coming from the citizens who have been mobilizing for that particular action. We haven't really come to terms with this issue. We are experimenting, but this is the tricky point. This is the bottleneck, and also a bit of a moment of truth in Europe with a conference on the future of Europe, which is entirely based on a deliberative model that will come up with many recommendations, probably bolder than those present in the political space. But at the end of the day, it will be the political actors calling the shots and deciding what to do with it. This is the tricky point, and at the moment, sorry to show you this pretty dark image, but these are ships passing in the night. The participatory input has one channel and the representative input has another one. They just don't talk one another. Also institutionally, there are no obligations to actually take a stance, there are no obligations to act, and there's a risk of cynicism that we are inducing, because at the end of the day, the mechanism might be perceived as cosmetic, as yet another way to basically sell a story and to get legitimacy in a different way. So this is a bit of a cautionary tale that I think is important to mention at the very end of my brief presentation. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you. Aura?
Go ahead. Okay, so my name is Cifuentes. I am from Colombia. Thank you very much for having me here. I am invited as an ambassador of One Young World, so very honored to be here. So how did it work? Yeah, perfect. So I have been working in the public sector for the past 5 years, and I want to share with you some of the things I have learned, because I do believe that the public sector awakens some of the deepest emotions a person can have. Even if you are a public servant, as I am right now, you don't stop fulfilling the role, the most important role in a society, the role of being a citizen, right? So being a public servant, at least in Colombia, it awakens both passion, frustration, it generates commitment, responsibility, and at the same time, the certainty of knowing in advance that we are birds of passage. We are only transitory. And we know that because those are the rules. We know that administrations change every 4 or 5 years. Priorities change along with new leaders. And therefore, the ideas that we foster while we are on duty are fundamental. And even small ideas that we foster can become great and sustainable public policy. So that is why today I want to ask you, for me, the most important question. How do you plant those ideas so that they can become long-term behaviors? I have had the great privilege of working in the topics that I consider are the seeds of the future of the public sector. Especially now that we are dealing with the pandemic, the language surrounding public sector innovation has been changing in the last decade. Digital transformation, public sector innovation, GovTech, are words whose uses have changed in the last 10 years, the past 10 years. 10 years ago, no one was interested in those issues. And today, I think it is impossible to ignore them. And this is why today I want to focus on the 3 seeds that I consider all public servants must make sure to sow, to care for, and to nurture so that when the next administration arrives, because they will arrive, we'll see their value and allow them to keep growing. So my first insight is open-minded thinking by default. The public sector has changed. Not only it is not the same as before, but I do believe it cannot be the same as before. And we need a more open, agile, and intelligent public sector to address some of our most pressing challenges. For example, the UN Global Sustainable Development Goals cannot be underestimated. We are facing complex problems with a high degree of uncertainty, and therefore solutions must be built with greater skills. We need multidisciplinary work teams with more skills training than diplomas hanging on the wall. We need public servants with an open mind to understand that the ego of the public sector has done us a lot of harm. And I think it is time to be humble. We should be open to listening and understanding new approaches because we really need to try different or new solutions. And that's an easy thing to say, I know that, but it takes a lot of will and determination to apply. So my invitation here is that we really need to be pioneers and ambassadors for open governments. Let's look at the second insight. User-centered design as the main principle of public policy. Innovation in the public sector is a leadership issue. It is not only a vision, it has to be a plan. And we need to move from talking about public servants to future makers. We need more people imagining new and better futures, and that involves the co-creation with users. Because yes, people, citizens are our users. Entrepreneurs, I believe, have a lot to teach us in that way. They're constantly testing their business models while they use agile methodologies, and they iterate their solutions with feedback loops. They are fast but patient, and you know what? They know how to listen to their users. So why don't we do the same with public policy, right? Why don't we do the same in the public sector? I do believe that we need leaders that are open to work with design teams to expand their visions, because those leaders often generate empathy with citizens. And because of this, they actually make their insights actionable. So this is happening more and more, for example, in public technology projects, because we have UX experts involved in those projects. But I do believe that we need to expand that to other sectors, including the most traditional ones. And finally, my third insight. It's not changing. Prototyping is a muscle. And I think that, like any muscle, if you want to build it and if you want to improve your performance, you have to train. And we talk a lot about training and strengthening skills in the public sector, but we must consider the public sector as a safe place to learn, because learning implies the chance of failure, and we are not very good at failure, actually, in the public sector. So this is why governments are looking into policy experimentation as a fertile ground. And I do believe that innovation labs in governments are mandatory. Like, we really need to be advocates for those teams that challenge the status quo. We must be looking forward to having more ambitious exploratory pilots in search of better public futures. So, not changing. These are the three insights I consider critical when looking towards the future of public sector innovation. However, how do we put them into use? Because we definitely need tools for the job, right? For dealing with complex problem solving, every public servant needs tools to develop and advance a systems mindset. All systems are dynamic and often complex, and that's why we need a more holistic approach to understand phenomena. If we have a toolkit that will enhance our ability to think divergently and creatively for a positive impact in public policy. Now, in order to strengthen democracy, policymakers must become more future-oriented. We must ensure that these three insights are present in the public sector no matter the country. We need public servants who are willing to surf around resistance and skepticism because they will find both. So I do think that as a worldwide nation, we are responsible for implementing and fulfilling the idea to have a government as a platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aura. Claudia?
You don't have slides.
No, I don't have any slides, so maybe I'll stand over here so I'm not with my back to you, Max.
Fair enough.
Hello, everyone. My name is Claudia Chwalisz. I lead the area of work on innovative citizen participation, thinking about the future of democracy at the OECD. And I'm here to talk to you today about why deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies are one of the ways in which we can bring citizen representation and public judgment into democracy. So, imagine you receive an invitation from your government, inviting you to be serving as a member of a citizens' assembly on how to address and advance on the issue of gender equality. So how can we change the social norms around this? How can we change the structural pay and wage inequalities? And then how can we also change workplace rules and norms around co-parenting, shared leave responsibilities, shared caring, etc. To be able to try and tackle this issue, you'll be one of 99 other people just like you who through a civic lottery have received this invitation from all walks of life and will be coming together with this diversity of people who are that broad microcosm of the population when it comes to gender, to age, to socioeconomic status, and to the geography of your nation. Together with these 99 people, you will have the time over the course of 11 days, spread out over 4 months, to hear from all sorts of experts on the issue. You'll hear from lots of different stakeholders. You'll also be able to request more information, though, if you feel like you haven't fully understood something, or maybe there's another source you haven't heard yet or would like another perspective. And together over the course of all of that time, you'll work together to try and find some common ground and try to reach some public judgment for the recommendations you'll put to the government. Because you haven't been invited there just to give your personal opinion on the issue. Your role is as a citizen representative to put yourselves in the shoes of other people in the community and work together to find the common ground for the informed recommendations that you'll together put to the government at the end of this. Now, what I'm describing isn't just a hypothetical scenario. It's the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality that took place in Ireland earlier this year. It's one of a series of citizens' assemblies that have been taking place in Ireland over the past number of years. Some of you may have heard about the ones that took place on issues like abortion, on same-sex marriage, on the climate crisis. But this isn't only happening in Ireland. There are hundreds of thousands of people across the globe who have now received invitations and have served as members of citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries and citizens' panels all across the globe. They have addressed real issues, things like what should be our 10-year, $5 billion strategic plan for the city? What should be our 30-year infrastructure investment strategy? How can we tackle online hate and harassment? How can we improve the air quality in the place that we live? How can we do more to prevent flooding because it's becoming more of a risk with climate change? And I can go on and on and on with the sorts of real issues that are complex and urgent that have been addressed in this sort of way. In the O.E.C.D. report, Catching the Deliberative Wave, we have looked at 289 examples like the ones that I have just described. And this trend is growing. We're about to release a new database update that has over 100 new examples that have taken place in just the past year and a half. So it's a trend that's building momentum. This move towards seeing citizens not just in a participatory way, but actually seeing how they could be also used as citizen representatives. And I think when we start to think about this change, I mean, linking actually to what Alberto was saying earlier, we start to think about how deliberative democracy is actually a way to strengthen representative democracy by opening up who is considered a representative and also bringing our imagination beyond democracy as just being reduced to elections. But the question is that enough? You know, Alberto, you also mentioned this example of the French Citizens' Convention on Climate. And it's one of the examples where we've seen that, you know, there's a process that takes place. Citizens have deliberated for 9 months, have heard from loads of experts, have developed 150 really rigorous, thought-through, evidence-based recommendations for the government. But then these recommendations get passed back into the political system and the democratic system that still has all of the same incentives around short-termism, which are fueled by the electoral cycle, which are fueled by party politics, which are fueled by having a system which is designed for polarization rather than collaboration, which is designed for people to try and you know, debate and win their point rather than find where they have the common ground. And so to me, that's where one of the main tensions arises. And I don't see this as the issue being that, oh, well, we shouldn't do citizens' assemblies then. Because actually, we've seen that citizens' assemblies work. They create the conditions for everyday people to be able to grapple with complexity, to be able to find common ground, and to be able to encourage action on the urgent issues that we're all facing. So the problem is rather, how can we rethink about changing the democratic system more broadly in a more permanent and fundamental way to make deliberative democracy an embedded part of democracy, not just a one-off ad hoc thing that happens when there's some political will behind it, but something that actually becomes a part of how our democratic institutions function. And we're seeing this happening more and more today as well. So next month, we'll be releasing a new paper of the OECD that I've written that identifies 8 different models for institutionalizing deliberative democracy. These are all based on things that are actually happening in different places across the globe. So we have lots of inspiration about what we can do. We need now more politicians to be inspired by this, to be thinking about how can we actually change our democratic system to take public decisions better. And I think we're also at a bit of a tipping point where we also need to be doing a bit more work to inspire the bottom-up demand for this sort of change too, for citizens to have ideas, to be inspired by this, and to be asking their political representatives for this sort of change. So I'll be working with a few designers, Vera Sacchetti and Amelie Klein, to also develop a new initiative and a series of exhibitions around design and democracy, thinking about how democratic institutions, processes, and spaces can also be designed for a future democracy. And then we'll also be exploring these ideas further in the OECD Global Forum on Democracy early next year. Because I think that democratic systems can change, and not only that, but they really urgently need to. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Yes, I think also that democracy is changing. There are new tools that allow this change to happen. And today, I wanted to talk to you about digital citizenship. Exactly 2 years ago, I was giving a speech to the United Nations to advocate the importance of digital citizenship. And in particular, these 12 rights that are basic for digital citizenship. There are 3 of these rights. I'm not sure if you can read them, but 3 of them are the most important. The free internet access, digital education, and digital identity for all. These 3 main rights are the basis of
digital citizenship. Today, I wanted to talk to you about how one of these rights actually changed Italy. And we have a wonderful story of how one of these rights, digital identity, is actually changing, at the moment, Italy. We've always been told that representative democracy was a solution for a logistical problem. We had, obviously, a good example of how to use democracy. Here, I actually went jogging this morning where Pericles was pronouncing his speech. So there was a method of direct democracy tested 2,500 years ago. But we needed a solution to solve this logistical problem. So we invented participatory, representative democracy. But today, it is possible to involve people with digital tools. It is possible for people to meet up in virtual agoras. It is possible for people to propose, to discuss, to vote online. It is possible to get people interacting directly among them. So what is the main opposition that we have today? Well, it is the representatives that are in office, that obviously, once people go in office, they tend to think they are the best people to take those decisions. So we do have those two ships that just don't look at each other and hope that they won't touch each other, or at least the representative part hopes that the other part won't touch it too much. So this story today reminds me a lot of another famous Greek philosopher, Plato, that once came to Italy, in Sicily, in this theater in Syracuse, and saw something that scandalized him. He saw people applauding for the show. And he saw these people deciding what was right and what was wrong, what was beautiful and not so beautiful, just with their applause. So in his scripts, if you go and read them, you will see that he talks about this phenomenon as theatercracy, the people that decide what is good and what is not. And he is totally scandalized of how this can happen, because it was the intelligentsia that could decide what was good and not what was not, and what could go on the show. So that was the first time I found in the script that we talk about problems of getting people deciding from the base with an applause. Today we have, fortunately, there's no problem with applauding in a theater, but we still have some resistance in getting people involved directly online using all the technologies we have today. So what happened in Italy? This is the story I wanted to tell you today. Well, in Italy, we used a digital platform to get people involved, to get people discussing, raising their hands, proposing, voting, and we managed in around 10 years to get 2,500 people elected in office in various levels of institutions. We went 3 times to government as the main political force, using always a digital platform, the Rousseau platform. So we demonstrated that it is possible to get people involved. The community is of around 200,000 people, of which around 120 have the right to vote. But we've changed the model. We proposed the model of spokespeople and not members of parliament. We proposed a model of organizing online activities. And this obviously was much more efficient. In 2013, we went to elections, and at the time, there was the reimbursements from the state, and we spent 4 cents per vote received in organizational costs, and the reimbursements from the state were €4.70. That was more than 100 times what we actually spent. And at the time, we said no to those reimbursements, and those were around €42 million, to demonstrate that they weren't necessary to pay for politics. You could just crowdfund, and that was more than sufficient to have, at the time, 25% and then 32% of the share of the votes. So just to give you a glimpse of what Rousseau is, otherwise I'm too abstract, on Rousseau people can see each other, can search each other for competences and for many other characteristics, that they can take courses and do tests, obviously courses of how to go into institutions, how to handle the laws, how to be an active citizen. They can fund, do crowdfunding activities for every event they want to do. They can do mass brainstorming with the card system. They can share knowledge and comment knowledge of other people. They can create and manage physical and digital events. We have loads of events all over the place, and they can gain merits through the activity they do online in the platform for the community. And with these merits, they actually get ranked when there's votes. So when you have 1,000 people just coming up for the vote for the next election in Parliament, these are all ranked for the merits they have for the participatory activity they've been doing. And the online voting is obviously the most central part, or the most mediatical part, I should say, of the platform, where people have been voting every 20 days since 2012. That's every 9 days if you count actually the single votes that we've been doing on the platform. We've managed to have the world record of a binding vote in a single day, and to my knowledge it's still standing. And we've managed also recently, last week, to obtain the best participating platform award for impact in the world, and that was really a great achievement. But this is an example of how using digital tools you can actually get people participating and having an impact on the real world, because that is the main point, having binding decisions of the people that discuss, that promote the vote, and then things actually happen. Because we have a lot of examples of discussions, public discussions, that then end up in nothing, because the representative democracy part doesn't fit in with what we've been discussing or with the model that we've put in place. Today, another activity that is happening in Italy is the digital signature, just introduced in July this year. And with the digital signature, people can actually vote, can actually sign for referendums. So in Italy, you need 500,000 signatures that were normally collected physically. Today, we can collect them digitally. And this has had a boost of referendums. In these days, we're actually collecting for 5 different referendums, and we will be in the condition that we will have more referendums in Italy than laws proposed by MPs in Italy. So this is a switching point. In Italy, we have a lot of discussion today if it's become too easy to collect signatures. But I don't think it's a question of becoming too easy to collect signatures. I think it must be a question of representative idea of the population. 500,000 people, it's probably enough to represent an idea that then has to be taken to vote. So I think that is probably the main issue. So to close my speech today, I obviously very interested in understanding how this tool, Rousseau tool, can actually be used in other contexts. So please contact me if you do think this model can be applied elsewhere, not only in politics, also in other contexts of participation, because I think it's with the tools that we can transform those rights in actual change of reality. We need the tools of democracy to get those rights to be real. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Davide. That was fascinating. All 4 presentations, I think, gave us all so much to think about. Unfortunately, we're running short on time, so I'm just going to go with one question from our digital audience. Diane asks, how can we make changes in school and work to communicate an expectation of civic engagement? And I do think that's one of the questions that I found myself wondering. How do we create a culture where people want to participate in citizens' assemblies, where they're ready to sign up for these things, where it doesn't become, where they want to communicate with their government digitally, so that it's not another burden, it's not more homework. How do we make that part of our civic culture?
Can
any of us can jump in,
I mean,
please.
I'm happy to go for that. I think there's a few things that can be done. Well, part of it is actually trying to translate some of these ideas that we've been talking about from the political democratic sphere into other institutions. So actually the principle of having decision-making being taken by a broader representation of people chosen through lottery, we are seeing being applied actually in some schools. So replacing the culture of elected student councils with student councils where the students are randomly selected and then they take turns rotating and having that responsibility to represent their fellow students. In workplaces, we also have a lot of discussions happening about how you could change the composition of boards to also bring in different parts of the companies that are working in those organizations to also have a more equal say into the decision-making processes.
That's
a
fascinating.
few things.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but that is really interesting, and I think there's a lot more to discuss, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you afterwards, and hopefully the digital audience can continue to ask questions. We're now going to head into a 20-minute break. Everyone can go stretch their legs, grab a cup of coffee, and then we're going to come back for a tutorial on youth and new ideas for participation and information. So we'll see you back here in 20 minutes.